Okay, so today I'm going to be reviewing my gallery walk and what instructional methods I used and why I used them in my toolbox. So the first is my classroom context. So I was in my fourth grade classroom at East Vic South, where my students were split up equally between boys and girls, with there being maybe two more boys than girls, but they didn't like to interact very much with each other and were very separated in their ways and their thinking. All students received free lunch and breakfast due to COVID, but students were also able to bring in extra money for extras at lunch, like chips or ice cream. With social emotional learning, students have a chart located at their desk that each morning the teacher goes through and has them point at the emoji that they're feeling like to get a feel of what to be expected during that day. Two students who specifically need attention in the classroom were students A and student B. So student B is only in the classroom until 11:15 due to his inability to interact with others and always wanting to touch others. Student A did not like to write and will shut down if there's something that he doesn't want to do. So through his 504 plan, we were able to find alternate ways for him to complete assignments while also keeping him out from underneath his desk and causing a scene in the classroom. So there were 4 or 5 students above grade level, but 2 to 3 specifically stood out for me, and I would consider them gifted and talented as their math and reading scores were astronomical. One of the ladies in the class was at a 8th grade math level, so just seeing that and being aware of that was very important. So on a day-to-day basis, the teacher made the expectations very clear from when they arrived in the day to when they were leaving at night, and everything in between. The students knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing and when they were supposed to be doing it. So my scope of my lessons, my first 2 lessons that I taught were teacher-centered. So I taught my first one on Jumanji, where students had to find a problem and solution that was occurring throughout the whole story. So I started with a mini lesson that I kind of just introduced problem and solution, gave the kids some examples, and then I began reading in the literature. And I had the students first walk me through, do you think this is a problem and solution? And then I would give them a problem, or I'd give them a solution, and they would have to identify which one it was. And by the end of the lesson, students were able to apply directly what they learned in the mini lesson on their own and complete the rest of the story as we're reading it on the workbook paper. The second teacher-centered lesson was for students to solve multi-step money problems. So for this one, I did I do, we do, you do. So I first completed problems using manipulatives to solve problems that were in the students' workbook, just to show them like how it can be completed. I then guided them through it. I had them come up to the board, show me how to do it, and the students were able to kind of discuss with each other and build off each other. I think this was important to use scaffolding specifically during this lesson. So after I gave the guided lesson to the students, I let the students go off on their own, where they were able to complete 4 to 6, and they turned that into the tray so I could check and see where they at assessment wise and what I needed to focus on for the next day in class. My first student-centered lesson was on the engineering design process. So with this, I decided to do a project-based learning activity where students were learning about paper airplanes, the thrust, the lift that they have to fly, the difference between high pressure and low pressure, and what truly makes that airplane fly. So it was really cool for me to see the students start at the beginning with what the engineering process is and then work all the way through to identifying whether or not their paper airplane made it safe back home from the island that they were working with. And it was also cool because we were able to do some cross curricular with it and bring in some math along with that science and looking at the variables and the table that they were creating. So my second student-centered lesson was based on matter and the identification properties of a solid and liquid. So for this, I started with a jigsaw activity where kids were in their home groups and they were each assigned a different, whether that be matter, gas, liquid, and solid. After they identified what each one was, I broke them up into what each of them was. So I had a matter group, solid group, liquid, and gas group. And then after this, they had the opportunity to go back into their home groups and they created Oobleck, which was very fun for them to do. So with this, they were drawing conclusions on what they were finding. They were determining if Oobleck would be a solid or a liquid and how they knew it. So at the end of the lesson, students then had to complete an exit ticket or a class poll where they stated what they thought UBLIC was and why. So I thought this was really cool for students to take what they knew about solids and liquids and gases and fully transition it from that jigsaw activity into applying it with the UBLIC. So the instructional methods that I used was direct explicit instruction, where I led the demonstrations, where it was a mini lesson guided by the teacher and then the class worked as a whole. And then I did an I do, we do, you do, which was also teacher led. So I demonstrated to students how to complete the problem. Then as a class, we both completed problems together, discussing with each other why we thought one answer was right, one answer wasn't. And then students completed their problems on their own to demonstrate their learning. For my jigsaw activity, which was student-centered, the individuals were in small groups to become responsible for a subcategory of a larger topic. So then the students had to go and teach it to other people around the room. So then my final one was project-based learning, where students were actively involved in learning through real-world and personal meaning projects. So I had asked the teacher what the kids were really interested in then at this point in time during the semester, and she told me that they were really interested in airplanes because they had just learned about force and velocity and speed. And so I was like, oh, this is perfect. They can research about airplanes, and then they can use that as a student-centered lesson to incorporate the engineering process when designing an airplane and seeing if your airplane is going to flow, and just finding a solution and showing how they solved the problem. So these are some pictures from my student-centered lesson. The kids were really into this. Many of them were having a fun time drawing pictures out of how they thought their airplanes were going to look like, and then seeing how those transitioned into actual paper airplanes was very neat because they all struggled a lot with designing them correctly how they wanted to with how they drew it out on their paper. And then here's my Jumanji teacher-centered lessons. As you can see, the students are actively involved in this discussion, raising their hands and answering questions on what they believe the problem or the solution is. So I learned that even if you have a textbook lesson, you can make it fun and engaging and hands-on for students. It also is a good way to create discussion between the peers and the teacher as they complete those hands-on activities with manipulatives, or calling them up to the board and guiding them through the lesson so that they have a better understanding. Um, I also believe that for my student-centered lessons, it's okay to have a loud classroom because that shows that learning is occurring. I also think that it's important for in a student-centered lesson, specifically project-based learning, for students to have their own space, but to also be able to be close enough that they can still have that discussion, because discussion is huge in the classroom. So for my classroom assessment, they were assessed in several different ways. For my math lesson, they were given 5 to 8 problems at the end of the lesson that they would then turn into me so I could see, okay, what do I need to focus on for the next day? Do I need to reteach anything? For my student-centered lessons, they completed that experiment. They were able to fill out the table and chart that worksheet that I had given them that guided them through the lesson. So the main one that I focused on was the students' trials that they had and documented throughout their paper airplane experience. So the artifact allowed the students to show their knowledge from the research that they completed, what problem they were solving, why they were having this problem, why they thought their design was the best design to have. And it also allowed them to bring in cross-curricular activities with math, learning about variables, literature, tables, graphs. So it was a really good combination of assessing students not only in science, but bringing in that math and literature component too. So the types of assessments for each lesson: for my Jumanji lesson, I did this over class discussion and anecdotal notes or observations from the teacher. And then for my UBLIC, which is the jigsaw, the students did the exploration and completion of the lab. I also looked at the exit tickets and saw and took notes on why the kids thought this way, or how they wrapped their mind around why UBLIC was a solid or liquid or both. And it was really cool to see once you started discussing with the students' brain clicked. It's like a light bulb went off when you started talking about how if you spin it faster, that UBLIC turns into a solid, but when you stir it slower, it's a liquid. So it was really cool seeing the light bulb go off when the students finally recognized that it could be both. For my solving multi-step money problems, it was a formal assessment of the students completing math problems for me and then turning it in so I could see what they had learned. And finally, with the engineering design process or the project-based learning, the students presented their research to the class as a whole. And they described what went good, what went wrong, what they would do next time, what they figured out in their research, and why they designed the plan the way that they did. So the next steps, even though I had good data with my assessments of learning, I feel like there's some several areas I can improve on. I think that specifically with the student-centered project-based learning lesson, even though the students are completing the lesson on their own, I think that it could be a lesson that I include more of a jigsaw activity where each student researched and read about the processes in the engineering design process, or the specific properties that make a plane fly with thrust or lift and speed and velocity. Before going into the activity and the experiment, because I think that it would give students more of a big grasp and it would bring in different components that each student picked out from the learning.